Good afternoon, welcome. Let's get settled. Good to see you on the line. Thanks for coming out. For those of you who don't know or whom I haven't met yet, I'm Steve Slick in the Intelligence Studies Project, and on behalf of our team, as well as our colleagues at the Clements Center for National Security and the Strauss Center for International Security and Law, welcome to today's book talk with the author of By All Means Available, Memoirs of a Life in Intelligence, Special Operations and Strategy. Great. So before I introduce our guest, who's working in the wings here, let me acknowledge for all of you the horrific attacks that were carried out last weekend by Hamas against civilian targets in Israel. Now, the facts surrounding these attacks are still coming out, but we know you all will be interested in learning from these tragic events as they unfold. And in that regard, first, you'll have the opportunity today to ask our well-qualified guest for his analysis of the situation and the difficult operational and policy choices that lay ahead. Second, the Clements Center, the Strauss Center, and the Intel Studies Project will be hosting an event at the Crum Auditorium in Rowling Hall Thursday, as in tomorrow, at 5:15 p.m. We'll have an expert panel convened. We'll discuss and take student questions on the attacks and their implications. So we're very fortunate today, and actually throughout the week, to host Dr. Mike Vickers. Mike retired from public service, but not public life, in 2015, after serving as the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. In that capacity, Mike was the senior civilian exercising, and this is a term of art, authority, direction, and control over the Defense Department's so-called combat support agencies, including the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Before serving as USDI, Mike was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations in Low-Intensity Conflict. Mike's rich, varied, and impactful public service career began with his enlistment as a non-commissioned officer in the Army's Special Forces. He had been commissioned as a Special Forces officer by the time he eventually applied for the career trainee program at CIA. But before his operational training was even completed there, Mike had been dispatched by the agency on critical assignments to the Caribbean and to Lebanon. After his training, Mike was assigned to the predecessor of the Special Activities Division, where he thrived as the program manager and chief strategist for the Reagan administration's covert program to expel the Soviet Army from Afghanistan. Mike stepped away from government to complete graduate school and co-founded an influential think tank in Washington, D.C., until finally President Bush persuaded Mike to return to government as part of the leadership team at the Pentagon. So my introduction doesn't do justice to the incredible range of Mike's career and accomplishments. I encourage you to buy at your favorite bookstand and read this wonderful and engaging memoir. Indeed, I was going to say we had a stack of them, but the stack is gone. We can order another stack for you. You may be able to get Mike to sign your book if you promise him that you'll read it from cover to cover. Before I turn the floor over to Mike for a few framing remarks, I neglected to mention that Mike is no stranger to the 40 acres. He knows his way around. He's the proud parent of a recent Longhorn. So with all that, let's welcome Dr. Mike Vickers.
Thank you, Steve, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Steve asked me just to say a few words to frame the discussion, and then he'll ask me some questions, and then hopefully we'll leave plenty of time for you questions and comments about the writing and vetting process, why I wrote the book, and then illustrate some of the key principles with a few vignettes, and then I want to talk about the back end of the book where I look forward a bit. So if you spend your life keeping the nation's secrets, it's not easy to write a book like that. And it kind of goes without saying, whatever writing challenges you have. And, a number of us took an oath to keep those secrets until we go to the grave, and there are many that I will. The reason I wrote the book is three principal reasons. One, my former boss, Bob Gates, and one of my mentors and a few others said, given the experiences I had, and then at the sub-cabinet level, I had a duty to history to try to write an unclassified history of some of these events. The second reason was, since most of this world is really secret, where as senior leaders we can share some of it with the American people. That's important in democracy too. But the principal reason that really motivated me as my time in government service was coming to an end was really to try to help the next generation, to pass on what I'd learned, what worked, what didn't work, what we can take forward, because it's a dangerous world. And if we're handing the keys over to the next generation, we want them to do even better than we did. And so, that was really the motivation. And fortunately, CIA and the Department of Defense and the White House were very good about clearing the book. Took 10 months because of COVID, mainly because of the size of the Department of Defense and everybody has to look at it. But eventually got done. And one of the things I tried to do in writing the book was, at least for the version I sent to the government for clearance, was to document everything that had been cleared in other memoirs or declassified intelligence reports to make it a little easier for them. So let me now turn to some of the key principles or themes I'd like you to take out of the book and illustrate them with some vignettes. So there were three big operations that I had the great fortune to participate in my lifetime. Lots of others, but three really stand out. As Steve mentioned, one of them, as a CIA officer, was the Covert Action Program, the largest in CIA's history. Many argue it's the most successful, that ended up expelling the Soviets out of Afghanistan. The second was our multiple campaigns against Al-Qaeda to deny them any sanctuary and to disrupt, dismantle, and defeat the group, particularly between 2007 and 2015. And then the third was the raid that brought justice to Osama bin Laden. And so two of those, I did as a policymaker, and one of them as an operator, and lots of other things are there. So a couple of themes I'd really like to emphasize. One of them is, if you look back from the late Cold War, where we started doing really well against the Soviets, the last decade in particular, but decade and a half. And then through our war with Al-Qaeda and wars in Iraq and Afghanistan the past couple of decades, America is usually on the strategic defensive, but offensive defensive strategies work far better. I have lessons in the book on strategy, intelligence, and special operations. I'm just going to hit some of the strategy ones here. But offensive, defensive strategies work better. And so, from my experience, the Reagan doctrine, supporting anti-communist forces in Afghanistan's case very aggressively in the Cold War, but also things like putting Pershing II missiles in Europe that countered the Soviet SS-20 intermediate range nuclear ballistic missile, that led to a historic arms treaty with the Soviets, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, and others, and then using our attack submarines to hold Soviet boomers at risk. All that added up to give us a pretty successful grand strategy. On the Al-Qaeda front, there was the same thing. Once President Bush made the decision to go to an intensive drone campaign, or as we say, Predator, the name of the aircraft, armed reconnaissance and precision strike, that really broke Al-Qaeda's back, first in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region, and then more recently in Yemen and other theaters. And then even with the bin Laden raid, another theme that I emphasize in the book is escalation dominance. And so what is escalation dominance? Well, if you think about World War II, why we won World War II? Well, lots of reasons. We learned, we did other things. But once the American economy was put on a war footing, we could outproduce our adversaries dramatically. And famous Japanese Admiral Yamamoto said, we will run wild for 6 months, but then we've woken up a sleeping giant, and then we're going to be in trouble. And that proved prophetic. Escalation dominance applies to the nuclear realm, but also to conventional operations and even counterterrorism operations. So to illustrate, with the Soviets in 1985. When I was fortunate to get the job as the Afghanistan Covert Action Program Officer, our budget had just gotten quadrupled by a famous Texan, Charlie Wilson, in Congress. CIA had asked for a 10% budget increase and it got a 300% budget increase. Trust me, you don't see that every day. And so we began to escalate our efforts in Afghanistan, and President Reagan changed our goal in March 1985 with a then top secret national security decision directive to drive the Soviets out rather than just impose costs on them. And then we sought to escalate further and convince Congress to double our budget again. The Soviets escalated at the same time. Like a lot of leaders frustrated with wars that are stalemates, Mikhail Gorbachev added 26,000 forces in 1985 to the 100,000 that were already there in Afghanistan, and gave his generals a year or two to win the war. At the end of that year, our escalation had beaten theirs, and they started looking for the withdrawal. Same thing was true on the drone campaigns. Between 2004 and 2008, we did about 35 strikes against Al-Qaeda. We did that many in 4 months in 2008, and it continued after that. And that intensity really pinned Al-Qaeda down and hurt them. And even something like the Bin Laden raid. We thought there were 4 armed men, including Bin Laden, in that compound among the 23 men, women, and children that were there. We sent in 24 SEALs to do the job. We had a reaction force of double that number 5 minutes away. We had fighter aircraft on alert in case the Pakistanis scrambled fighters. And so, tried to anticipate every contingency, but make sure we could dominate the local situation and accomplish the mission. And then the third theme, I guess I'd like to emphasize in the book, or from the book, is that battles are won or lost, or wars are won or lost. As Clausewitz famously said, war is an extension of secret wars or open wars, or an extension of politics by other means. And that's true, they said, for secret wars as well. They're won or lost often in the capitals based on policy choices, and if not ours, sometimes in the capitals of your allies. And so, America doesn't go to war without allies, including our secret war. And coalition warfare is quite challenging politically. So let me wrap up and offer a few thoughts on a little unusual for a memoir. I have a chapter at the end called Winning the New Cold War. And it's a prescription about how we can compete over the long term and prevail over China and Russia, if they stay aligned. And there's 5 things I talk about. Restoring our national unity and resilience has a lot of dimensions to it, economic and others. What I think is the central competition between us and the Chinese over the long haul, the economic and technological competition. In the 20th century, we never had an adversary who had more than 50% of our GDP. China's stumbling right now, but they're at 60% or so. And if they get their act together, they may surpass us next decade. And so that economic escalation dominance that we had in the 20th century, we won't necessarily have in the 21st. And then there's AI and quantum computing and synthetic biology and a lot of other things that are remaking the world. And that's a central part of that. And then related to that is the competition for global influence, particularly information influence, and what I describe as winning the intelligence wars across the board. That contributed a lot to how we kept the Cold War cold, and then how we ultimately won it. And then I have a section on strengthening our regional and global deterrence, including ideas on transforming intelligence and defense, and then finally our national security institutions and allies. Now, it paints a challenging period ahead of us for the next couple of decades, including our challenges at home. It's been said that when intelligence officers tend to tilt a little bit toward the realist side, not using international relations clearly, but just trying to see the world the way it is. And as a consequence, on the optimistic, pessimistic scale, a little more toward the pessimistic view of things, because we look for threats. And it's been said when an intelligence officer sees flowers, he or she immediately looks around for the coffin, you know, so I may be a little guilty of that as well, but you'll have to judge for yourself. So with that, I've kind of hit the highlights of the book. There's a lot more in it, but you probably have a lot of questions on current events, and so we can take this wherever you'd like. Steve.
Great. Thank you, Mike. That's terrific. Well, I promised you one softball,
Okay, good.
but you already swung at that. That's why I write a memoir. It's not unprecedented in the security, intelligence, and military communities, but it's also not the norm. So I appreciate your explanation, and this is the target audience then, based on your explanation. So I'll go to a second one. This one's going to be over the plate, but it's not so soft. Career management. So we've got a lot of folks in the audience here who are interested in pursuing a career like yours, preparing for public service, maybe in foreign affairs or national security. And I was curious in looking through your book, what lessons there were, because you did a number of things in and out of government for a number of different agencies. There doesn't appear to be much of a pattern there, right? And so I'm going to ask you to sort of organize that. I particularly appreciated and enjoyed your explanation for why you were drawn to guerrilla warfare. You said because you liked freeing people from tyranny. That's
what I thought I would like.
That's a lot to digest. But you made a lot of career choices, big career choices, lurching career choices. And then within that, a lot of specific assignments. This assignment, not that assignment. And I don't think it was random. So what were the guideposts? What was steering you through this adventurous career you had?
So I actually had a high school teacher my senior year when we were in the school library researching term papers. And he put a copy of that day's New York Times on the desk in front of me and opened it up to a story about CIA's paramilitary operations in Laos as part of the Vietnam War, biggest one at the time, and said, you might be interested in this. And I thought, I don't know why he thought that. And I'm dreaming about throwing touchdown passes or hitting baseballs, not softballs, but turns out I was. And so as I realized my passion for baseball and football wasn't matched by my abilities in baseball. I started thinking, what am I going to do? And I thought, well, I'd like to be James Bond. And so so my path was to become a Green Beret, and I had studied some Russian in college at that point, and then acquire some more experience, and then go into the CIA. And that part, up until and I had this weird view when I was 19 that I couldn't wait. I wanted to just skip over my 20s with a lot of training. I couldn't wait to be in my 30s because that's what James Bond was. And I figured I'd be fully trained, and I had a 10-year plan. And it more or less worked out. I mean, careers are as much by design as anything else. But then after that, or luck as well as design. After that, I had no idea. I came into CIA with Russian, Czech, and Spanish. And so I thought I was like you, go to serve in the Soviet bloc at the beginning. And first thing happened, I got sent for the invasion of Grenada, and then Lebanon, the response to the Beirut bombings of our embassy, and then Marine barracks, and then finally the Afghan program. And so, I ended up spending a lot of my time in the Middle East and have been doing it since. So that part's, not so much by design, but it's always good for, I think, a special operator or a intelligence officers to go where the action is, or as we say, run to the sound of the guns. And so I tried to make that a bit of a mantra. And then later in my career, after I developed expertise in those areas, covert ops, clandestine operations, and special operations intelligence, I broadened during my graduate study years and think tank years to nuclear strategy and space and future warfare. And that helped when I became a senior official in the Pentagon. But mentors were critically important. They gave me a lot of jobs. I didn't necessarily pick them.
Would you, and feel free to identify them, would you describe your relationship to mentors? What did they mean to you, and at what points in your career, and who gets credit for helping put you where you ended up?
Yeah, so early on, I was the junior member of Special Forces teams tasked to go into Eastern Europe in the event of war, all
With something on your back?
with a backpack nuclear weapon. But 23, it seemed like a good idea. Doesn't seem so good anymore, but all my teammates were Vietnam veterans. Some had done incredibly dangerous missions. Others were Eastern European emigres who were beneficiaries of the Lodge Act and knew their homelands and wanted to liberate their homelands. So I got a really great education early on, along with a lot of formal schooling in the military. And then, got selected for early command by a Special Forces colonel of a counterterrorism unit. And then CIA, same thing. An officer picked me out of training and sent me to Grenada. Bill Rooney.
Bill Rooney passed away.
Passed
Rest in
away.
peace.
And may he rest in peace. And then a couple of others picked me for the Afghan program, and wouldn't have accomplished anything without them. And then later in life, Bob Gates, the Secretary of Defense, gave me a lot of responsibility as an assistant under Secretary of Defense of Leon to continue it. So, mentors teach you things, but they also empower you and enable you, and have your confidence in you and let you do things. And and that's been what I attribute whatever success I've had.
And the local addendum, Bob Gates would identify Bob Inman as a key mentor in his career.
Indeed.
So there's a continuum.
Indeed.
Okay, you also mentioned something else I was going to raise with you, and that's the Afghan Covert Action Program. You describe it in the book as a decisive battle in the Cold War. And you talked a little bit about the change in policy about the time you arrived, the Reagan administration shifting its aim in the covert action from simply bleeding and inflicting pain, inflicting costs on the Soviet army for the occupation to actually expelling them, sending them home back across the Freedom Bridge, right? Eventually came to pass. You also described the resources, right? All of a sudden there's money available that wasn't available before. Would you just complete the story from there? And because your account of all this is historically significant because of your role, and there's still misunderstandings around this. So pick it up with the Stinger anti-aircraft missile. What should people understand about that? And then also trace us from the Soviet withdrawal in 1989 to the collapse of the Soviet Union 2 years later. It's an extraordinary claim that this decisive battle, decisive defeat led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I think I share your assessment of it, but I'd like to hear it.
Sure. So, the first thing I think is that one, it was serendipitous that Congressman Wilson took this interest and dumped this and got away with it. And something we probably couldn't do today to, dump hundreds of millions of dollars on an agency. But then, as is often the case, opportunity grows out of crisis. And so there were criticisms. The war was 5 years on and it was a stalemate, and no analyst believed that the insurgents could win. Red Army had never been defeated. And the assessment of Gorbachev when he came to power is that he wouldn't do anything too risky because he needed to shore up his domestic base. So, it didn't look too favorable. And we were being criticized on the right, which has echoes of Ukraine today, that the program was riddled with corruption, and the Pakistanis, our frontline state, were keeping all the weapons for themselves and they weren't getting in. And then those on the left were saying, this is hopeless, you're fighting to the last Afghan. And so that triggered a National Security Council review. And I helped write the outcome that ended up in this presidential directive with a partner on the NSC. But it reviewed all our objectives and, should we stay the course? Should we do this? And one of them was drive the Soviets out by all means available. And I looked at that, I thought, well, that's the one I want to do. We got all these resources, and fortunately, CIA management agreed with me. And that's where the title for the book comes. And then we had to persuade all our allies. Chinese, they were our biggest arms supplier. It's a very different world then than it is today. Pakistan, the frontline state, Saudi Arabia, which matched our funding dollar for dollar to escalate with us. And that took some months. And then to start introducing more sophisticated weapons. So at first, I wanted to get a British surface-to-air missile called the blowpipe because we couldn't put US weapons in. And at first, the British government said no, and then we kept at it. And 6 months later, Margaret Thatcher approved it. So we put that in. And so to your question about the Stinger, President Reagan made the decision to, after the Pakistanis really wouldn't accept US weapons for the first 6 years of the conflict. And then President Zia, president of Pakistan at the time, had a change of heart and said, I think it's time to introduce the Stinger. So we said, sure, why not? And President Reagan approved it in January 86, formally signed in March 86, and it was introduced in September 86. It had a remarkable record. It shot down 75, had a 75% kill rate. But the Soviets had essentially decided to withdraw by that point. So it more kept them heading toward the exit than was the decisive war winner. The biggest year in terms of casualties and everything was really this knockdown drag out in 1985. And then the rest was kind of continuing to push them out. Their first withdrawals occurred before the Stinger was put in, and then they really picked up steam. And after the Soviets relaxed their war aims, from trying to keep a communist Afghan government to just saying, we want out, whatever government ends up there, ends up there. And that's what led to the last soldier, General Gromov, crossing the Freedom Bridge. So then to your question about the aftermath, once the Soviets withdrew, the same year, the Berlin Wall fell, Eastern Europe was liberated.
You're welcome.
Yes. Very good. And the Afghan program was important in defeating the Soviets, but so was the system of solidarity, so it's and then, being honest, Mikhail Gorbachev was a leader that had other objectives, and these were obstacles to revitalizing the Soviet economy and liberalizing in certain ways. A different leader probably would have stayed longer, suffered longer, but, so that made a difference too. But I think it did play a role in ending the Cold War. And then, the tragic part of it is that in 1990, we were forced by a congressional amendment to cut off all aid to Pakistan because President Bush, the Fessler Amendment, President Bush couldn't certify that Pakistan wasn't on it crossed the line over toward nuclear weapons. And we disengaged from the region. And Afghanistan descended into the hell, Taliban came to power, Al-Qaeda invited in, and the rest is history. The reason there's not a straight line between the Afghan in the 80s and the horrible attacks of 9/11 is that there were a lot of policy. There's 12 years, and there were a lot of policy choices as you look at these this sanctuary gathering in Afghanistan that you could take action against, and we did. And so the way we did counterterrorism after 9/11. In retrospect, we should have done before, but that wasn't our policy at the time.
Thanks for that, Mike. The only thing I'd add, I think it was in what you're describing, was that another impact of the military defeat in Afghanistan was that the people of the Soviet Union discovered the government was lying to them.
Yes.
As the body bags came home.
That's right.
They were claiming they weren't suffering losses in Afghanistan. No, they were suffering grave losses. And the people in the towns and villages of the Soviet Union knew that because their kids weren't coming home. Yeah, right. That broken trust from the Chernobyl disaster, when they allowed the people to celebrate May Day in the streets rather than warning them to go inside and protect themselves against this radioactive material coming out of the air.
Yeah, and to give you a sense of that, the official, and they're doing the same thing in Ukraine today, lying about the casualties are suffering. The official Soviet estimate of losses in Afghanistan was 13,000 something or other. It was actually double, and it was over 26,000. And in the brief opening after the Cold War, the Russian general staff wrote a history of it and disclosed that. But yeah, so that, and then Chernobyl, and then lack of confidence and being told the truth, and others, and ironically, a lot of Ukrainian mothers, they were bearing a bigger brunt of it than some other parts of the Soviet Union.
So staying on, not the Soviet Union, but Russia, turning to Russia, Ukraine, I know even in your household, you have interest in following this quite closely, and I know you have views because you've shared some of them with me. If I could ask you just to assess the strategies of the two belligerents, disposition of forces, what has happened in 18 months or so, and what you expect to happen. And if you would use two of the terms that are prevalent in your book, the one being a war-winning strategy. Does either side have a war-winning strategy? And secondly, escalation dominance. Is either side approaching escalation dominance?
So Putin thought he could win quickly, and Russia had been on a roll. We had largely ignored them for a lot of the post-Cold War period, and they first succeeded in a limited operation in Georgia in 2008, and in Ukraine, annexing Crimea and stirring up trouble in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine in 2014. We didn't respond much to that, didn't provide any lethal assistance to the Ukrainians. 2015, they intervened in Syria, and again, we're kind of heading toward the exits then, and so the Russians perceive they have a victory. 2016, they intervene in our presidential election on a bigger scale than they've ever done before. And then 2021, they see our disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. And then Putin gives his crazy Ukraine's not a real country speech again in July 21. And then we follow it up with statements. We're not going to commit any forces or do anything. And so he thought he had a green light, and he thought it would be easier than it was. The Russian army turned out to be much worse. Ukrainians turned out to be much better. But it settled down into static warfare in the East. And, one of the challenges is of the Ukrainians, they didn't have a real choice in the matter based on how they were equipped, but the Russians essentially have 9 months to dig in and create the defensive belts. And, U.S. policy has been to gradually equip them, first saying we're not going to do something, then we do it. But still, they don't have the tanks that they were promised. They don't have all the engineering equipment to clear minefields. They don't have fighters. They don't have enough artillery or rocket artillery to beat. America, we know how to fight the Russians from our Soviet Cold War days and these defensive belts. We wouldn't fight the way we're asking the Ukrainians to fight right now, without air superiority, without artillery and or sufficient artillery and others. And so they're fighting. It looks like World War I, because that's what you do when you don't have the other stuff, and you're trying to make modest gains and clear minefields laying on your stomach. And so neither side has escalation dominance right now. Putin thinks he can outlast the West. That's his strategy. His strategy is essentially, we'll get tired and leave, and the politics of the West will work for him at some point. He's hoping our 2024 election turns out a certain way. He's been back in the same horse several elections now, and one time he won, one time he didn't win, but he's hopeful for 2024. And if the Ukrainians have a more successful counter offensive next year, then, and if the elections don't go the way he wants, or the West doesn't wobble as much as he hopes it will, then he may reconsider his position in 2025, but not before. And and then on the Ukrainian side, they may gain a lot of their territory. The question is whether they can gain it all and how fast. And that depends on us as much as them. But it's a daunting problem, for a smaller country to, they're suffering a lot of casualties too, to sustain this fight, this high intensity fight over a longer period of time. So I think our aim ought to be to try to do what we can to bring this war to a conclusion as soon as possible to get on with the rebuilding, but also long wars just hurt. They undermine democracies, but they also, inflict a lot more human suffering and casualties. And, if you're stuck with it, you're stuck with it. But if you have a choice, you should try to make it more decisive soon.
A threshold question I always like to pose on complicated situations like this is, on whose side is time here?
Yeah, I mean, Russians certainly think it's on theirs, and just like the Taliban did, the Taliban famous.
Taliban proved to be
The Taliban
correct
proved
in
to
that
be
sense.
right, although it was self-inflicted wound on our part. But
That's next.
the Taliban said, you have the watches, we have the time. And Russians think the same thing. But in the long run, if Ukraine is more integrated into the West in the security architecture and the economic architecture, it'll be tough to do this.
Okay, thanks. You hit the next issue, and that's Afghanistan and future threats from terrorist organization. And so the Hamas attacks obviously remind us that our enemies are still out there, and they're lethal and they're dangerous. You described in the book the withdrawal from Afghanistan as a strategic blunder. You wrote Al-Qaeda will be back, and that President Trump and President Biden turned a stalemate that protected U.S. interests into a defeat that placed our interests in jeopardy.
Yeah, it's harsh language, but I think it's accurate in the sense that the Taliban never could have won had we not decided to leave and stop supporting the Afghan government, air power and advisors, and that caused them to collapse. And I think that's, and it was a rolling collapse. It isn't something that happened all at once. It happened in the provinces. And I think we are worse off in a sense that Al-Qaeda is down right now. ISIS-K, the branch of ISIS that's in Afghanistan, is reasonably down. But when you give these groups time to reconstitute, they think time's on their side, and they do. We've seen that over and over again the past 20 years, where they had their sanctuary in Afghanistan, they lost it. They went to Pakistan cities, they got captured, they went to the frontier region, and the threat to America went up. We started striking them, the threat went down, they moved to Syria with the civil war, and the threat went up from there. They built up operations in Yemen, and the threat went up from there. And, it's just a very, very familiar pattern. So it doesn't take much, it takes intelligence, it takes overwatch with the predators, and doing it from a distance imposes costs on you. It takes relationships with foreign government. We're much better off in Afghanistan having a government on our side than a hostile government. So that's my main point.
You wrote in an
And
earlier
Ryan
chapter.
Crocker, a lot of the Afghan hands, I think share my assessment.
Yeah, that's not a minority view.
Not a minority view, unpopular, and not a pleasant one, but.
So on that point, just to clarify, you'd written a couple chapters before this, that in 2010, in your view, that the United States had gained escalation dominance over Al-Qaeda, minimized the threat largely. And so your message is that in the succeeding years, we've surrendered that near victory or suppressed threat, and that now it's rising again, or that escalation dominance has been lost. Or how do I understand that?
Yeah, it's been eroded. I mean, we continue to have success through the decade. So the reason I say 2010 is after these barrage of strikes between 2008 and 2010, Al-Qaeda's top leadership made the decision to go to ground, to stop plotting and just try to wait us out. And we continued to trick them over time, and then had the war with ISIS, and Zawahiri was just killed last year, and some very dangerous people were taken off the battlefield in Yemen. So it really spanned a decade. But now our position is being eroded a bit. It's not collapsing, all of a sudden in the region, but it is being eroded. And, we have fewer governments to work with. We have to fly longer distances. We won't have the intelligence on the ground that we had when we were there. So, over time, the effects accumulate. That's more the point. And it would be easier to maintain, that stronger position at low cost had we not completely withdrawn.
So last question on that general topic, you were, of course, the senior civilian responsible for directing and overseeing the uniformed special forces. And I've noticed recently that the Army in particular is looking at, or it's being discussed that they may reduce the special operations forces by 10%. This has been interpreted as being part of this shift in national security focus from the Middle East, countering terrorism, to East Asia and peer competitors, China, to put a name to it. What do you think is the role for the U.S. Special Forces after this tremendously robust and active mission they've been at for 20 years after the 9/11 attacks, and now with America having new military and intelligence priorities to concern itself with? How do we maintain the current levels of special forces? Does the mission change? Does their staffing, training, and preparation differ in some way?
Yeah, so between 2001 and 2010, 10-ish, 2011, the manpower in special operations forces doubled. We did a really big buildup for all those wars, and the budget tripled and the deployments quadrupled. Even with our growth, we were using them more than we had planned. And so it's twice the size it was 20 years ago. And so, you might be able to trim here and there. The Army's, under a lot of budget pressure right now, deferring modernization and other things. But special operations forces, they have to maintain the counterterrorism mission and other missions, counterproliferation of weapons of mass destruction, if you have a loose nuke or things like that. But they're also important in engagement around the world, in the global competition for the white soft aspect, yes. And then, that'll be important with our strategic competition. And then for frontline states, the Baltics or Taiwan, they're important for, as we did in the Cold War, to build up stay behind networks, if big adversary invades, to make it much tougher for them to buy time for the United States. And then, if you're going to do some special reconnaissance or to enable the Air Force and Navy to strike better, they're the likely folks to get the job, particularly our Navy SEALs in a maritime environment like China, Taiwan. So there's still a lot of roles and traditional roles. And, they're 1% of the defense budget.
So you don't see that as an area where savings can be accrued, that can then be applied to other systems we may need?
Yeah, so
for the conventional war.
Yeah, 3 years ago in the, kind of strategic monism about China. And I mean, I've been working on the China issue for 30 years. It's important, but, we took 700 special operators out of Africa, the whole continent. And I mean, like, what are you saving there? You're going to go buy some coffee, or you're not going to buy many airplanes or submarines, but they savings, so it's a little penny wise and pound foolish.
Okay, that's terrific. Well, thanks very much to Mike for that. That satisfies me for the moment. What would you like to talk about? Kevin, you were quick.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Waiting. Nice to see you again, sir. I'm Kevin Lentz with Master Student
Yeah.
J School. Looking forward to reading your book, especially the last part on the competition with China. So in terms of the long-term intelligence competition with China, where would you say we're well situated? Where are areas you'd say we need work? And if you could put Indo-Pacific specific lens on it, that'd be great.
Sure, so, let me start with the part where we need work. So on the analytical side, this economic and technological competition, which I believe is central. If you look 30 years in the future, the country that's likely to be number one is the one that wins that. And so having enough analysts that understand quantum computing and AI and synthetic biology, it's a different challenge than we had in the past. And I think that's part of it.
Did we kick off your microphone? All of a sudden it got dull.
Yeah, maybe it's
Might have hit the button.
now it's still on.
Okay.
So that's one part. And then, in the Cold War, we had to develop techniques to operate in the Soviet bloc. We called them Moscow rules and the special course that trained people in doing that. The toughest operating environment, and then that was against, a lot of physical surveillance. The toughest operating environment now is in China. They have the place wired with cameras and artificial intelligence and monitoring the behavior all the time. So we can develop the tradecraft to defeat that, but it's going to take new thinking and new techniques, and just like we did in the 70s and 60s to get where it's on that. So third, and then the world is more transparent right now. So if you're going to conduct covert action, you have to deal with that. Digital currencies, there's a lot of adaptation that the intelligence community has, and new missions will come about. As you look at the strategic competition, technologies, space is a lot more important than it was 10 years ago. Cyber matters, so the community has to adapt to that.
I think that's a terrific answer, and I would add to that, I read something just recently that the CIA and the rest of the intelligence community now have accepted and are defining a resilience mission, right? To secure American supply lines for key manufacturing and for our economy in general, which is, for those of us intelligence traditionalists, doesn't necessarily sound like a job for the U.S. intelligence community to ensure the resilience of our supply lines, but it's important.
Yes.
If we don't do it. Admiral Linder.
One slight attempt at humor and a serious question for both of you. Were you involved in the decision not to let Miss World get on the helicopter with Charlie?
It's down in the weeds.
Yeah, so I wasn't, thankfully. The Foreign Defense Attaché of Pakistan made that decision, paid a price for a while. Charlie took to the airplane and moved it out of Pakistan until they said uncle, and then gave them their airplane back. So again, it was a different era, but
Serious, actually, both of you. What advice would you give to the unity government in Israel going forward?
Well, we reserved it for Mike and other professional judgments. Almost impossible to do at this highly emotional time, as the society is reeling from the horrific attacks, and temperatures are running high, blood is boiling. It can't help but be an emotional issue and a hard time to make cold decisions. But I think they should go very slowly and think very strategically about their choices, and ask themselves the question: are we doing what's best for Israel, or are we doing what Hamas expects us to do and wants us to do? And the possibility existing that they could transform or compound a tactical failing, a tactical shortcoming that led to the deaths of their citizens, into a strategic movement that has longer term and broader consequences. So this is obviously all dancing around the issue of a ground incursion, whether that's wise or whether that will play into their adversaries' hands. I'm encouraged by some of the ideas by Tom Friedman, people like that, to view this as a positive opportunity and maybe use this as an incentive to accelerate the normalization process with Saudi Arabia, which is likely what they were trying to disrupt. So do exactly what your enemy wants to prevent you from doing. That would take a lot of courage in a lot of Near Eastern capitals and some very clear-eyed, cold-blooded decision making. But I fear the consequences of a ground incursion and civilian casualties and loss of public sympathy and support, not just in the region, but globally, which could be a strategic defeat. Mike, do you want to take a crack at that?
I think Israel has to rethink its strategy against Hamas. You know, the previous conflicts were shorter duration. They didn't have this big ground incursion. They didn't have the number of Israeli casualties. And so the air power and containment approach for both political reasons in Israel, but also militarily, probably isn't going to address that. And then the $64,000 question is, you know, that's clearly what Hamas wants, is to draw them in and cause a lot of casualties on all sides, but then, you know, to tilt the strategic balance away from Israel. Now, bin Laden had the same idea and thinking he could draw us into Afghanistan. You know, it didn't turn out too well for them. But but urban fighting is tough. You know, it's just, and, you know, particularly tunnels and lots, it's just, so they do face it.
And no outside force understands Gaza as well as Israel.
Yeah.
They know exactly what they're walking into.
Yeah.
But I am encouraged that they brought some real defense expertise and talent apparently into the government. Benny Gantz and people like this are widely respected in all of our circles. These are smart people.
Wanted to ask a follow-up question to Kevin's on the China competition, which has to do with the issue you identified about economic and technical knowledge being increasingly important to the intelligence community and the analytical workforce. And Director Burns has talked about tech being one of his big four priorities, China being one of the others.
Right.
But I wanted to ask about the recruitment challenges that the IC faces in getting people with that expertise. And I guess I would be curious how you assess those challenges. I would see both a financial issue where people coming out with STEM backgrounds have often fairly lucrative paths in the private sector compared to government service. But there's also a cultural sort of difference between the startup culture of Silicon Valley or many emerging technologies that are in development. And some parts of government service, or at least there's a perception that these are very different cultures. So I just wanted to ask you about if you were giving advice either to students here on campus or to people who are trying to recruit the workforce that you would want in place for the future for this competition. How would you approach that problem?
Yeah, so I think a number of ways. One, for some of those people, you may need to rely on perm appointments, highly qualified government experts. You can do 5 years and usually extend it for a year or two. And that may be the way you get some of these leading technologists and others who have other opportunities. We've been very worried about that since the dawn of the cyber age. And yet, you know, generally we've done pretty well in retaining cyber expertise in the government because they get to do things you can't do anywhere else. You know, you get the toughest start. You know, and so as long as you have a sense of purpose that you're really contributing to the national security, it's, you know, public service is a noble calling. And, you know, it's when people feel that this is a bureaucracy and, you know, my life isn't as exciting as I thought it would be, that, you know, you have challenges or at the end of wars or, you know, when the environment shifts. But so I think a combination of those things, temporary hires, and then, you know, to counter the bureaucracy part, Bill Burns is a good example, right? I mean, served with him a lot of years, immensely talented person. He's different than almost his career path. It looks like a foreign service officer, but he became an ambassador 14 years or so into his service or something like that.
Could be in Amman.
In Amman, yeah. And, you know, he went, you know, and why? Because had a first tour, the Reagan administration and then the Bush administration realized how talented he was, and a guy named Jim Baker kept him by his side for several years and promoted him up. And, so, and then, his next job was political counselor in Russia, then ambassador, then assistant secretary of state, all decade ahead of anybody else. So if you can do it for him, there's got to be other Burnses in the government that you ought to be a little more flexible about promoting and giving greater responsibilities early on, like the private sector does from time to time. And so, we have things I think we need to rethink about it. War tends to force our hand, particularly all-out wars. World War II, we take people from colonels and make them four-star generals. I see the war all the time. So.
In the back, sir.
First of all, thanks to both of you for a lifetime of service to the nation. You mentioned China and even back in the days of Afghanistan and funneling weapons through them. If you could just strategically speak to where we may have missed the boat on China's rise, or what we could have done differently in terms of over the last 30 years, 40 years, around how we could counter where we find ourselves today.
Yeah, so the Chinese really went to school on us in Desert Storm. So we had this great victory, and a lot of foreign military studied this US victory, and the Chinese really uniquely concluded, terrible idea to get the United States 6 months to, move heaven and earth right on your doorstep. And then, use your brains, and so that was the beginning of their military strategy we call anti-adversarial denial, which is attack the forward bases. It's what's led to their missile buildup and other things, but attack the forward bases, eventually attack surface ships at sea, and it's eroded America's position in the Western Pacific. And so the Department of Defense recognized that over time, probably a decade later for sure, by 2001. But 9/11 attacks, took us in a different direction. And so we started modifying, started a new bomber program, started expanding our submarine fleet in 2006. But it's, the Department of Defense is a super tanker, and it takes time to turn. And so I think we've just been slow to recognize the dimensions of the problem that we have. I think, we're catching up now, but and then as it's moved from a operational problem in the Western Pacific to more the strategic competition, that's come of late. Part of that's a function of where the technology has been and how long their economy's been growing. But there was a hope in the 90s that we wouldn't face this, and I remember the military that had done so well in Desert Storm and the Balkan Wars was designed against regional competitors. And the thinking was, well, if a great power emerges, that one can handle that. And if we have to do terrorism or something else, the main force can handle it. It was wrong on both ends. It wasn't what we needed to fight Al Qaeda, and it isn't what we need to deter China. So we're fixing up there.
Terrific. Jeff, did you have yours?
This gentleman's tried about 4 times to get your attention, so.
I got it.
Thank you very much. I can absolutely ask questions on that, since I have to brief you in about 20 minutes on this.
Thanks.
So, sir, as you're looking at the strategic ends to the current fight, what are the possibilities for the normalization of Saudi Arabia having to do with the outreach to the Palestinian people that was promised to them by bin Salman?
That's a tough one. Maybe Steve wants to jump in on this, but part of the problem is a lot of the Arab world just moved away from the Palestinian issue, and I write about this a little bit in my book that I think in your time the cooperation between Israeli and Palestinian intelligence services was really pretty phenomenal, in terms of security on the West Bank. You had the Hamas problem, but, we would regularly meet with them as well. And I remember, senior Israeli officials, Shin Bet chiefs and everything say, look, we've done our job. We cooperate, we have threats at very low level. The politicians on both sides can't get you they can't take this operational security and turn it into peace. So that was the problem internally. And then a lot of the rest of the region just said, we got other issues, Iran or others, and this is not the front burner issue. So I don't know where it's going, but
Even though, as Mike says, our successive governments supported the growth of the Palestinian Authority security services. And one of the pillars of our support for that was that they develop their own relationships and cooperate closely with the Israelis, because no Israeli government was going to enter into a negotiated peace to live side by side with the Palestinian state if it couldn't provide for its own security, right? Because they wanted out of the occupation, but not at the risk of suffering daily attacks as they had in the Second Intifada. And so that was all fine and created an environment in which peace talks might have been pursued, but that didn't happen. And Gaza, we haven't started to talk about. There never was a solution to Gaza on the table. And so it's just, there's a reason it hasn't been solved in 50 years. This is one of the most vexing problems in international affairs, and it just got harder, right? So just time for maybe one or two more, and then we're going to have to wrap up. Sir, come back.
Hi, sir. Zach Walker, 2009 LBJ grad.
Welcome back.
Thanks, good to be back. You say in your book about how politics was Trump's strategy, unfortunately, and I'm curious in this context, how you see the next few months playing out as far as escalation dominance with Israel having to do something, and the Iranian support for Hamas possibly and Hezbollah. How do you see it all playing out if you were to guess in the next few months?
yeah, I mean, it's anybody's guess. I hope it doesn't turn into a regional war. I mean, Israel and, the US has moved some Gerald Ford aircraft carrier and other ships into the Eastern Med to try to deter Hezbollah in some way. But, Hezbollah had the 2006 war. It was partially, if I remember right, instigated by kidnapping. Yeah, kidnapping. And Hamas starting to have a powerful position in Gaza. So, that's besides the challenges of what to do in Gaza. That's certainly a big risk. Israel really had a dominant position, both from an intelligence perspective and a military perspective, that's increased over time, and economics, et cetera. And this is a real blow. And so, the danger is, with other things now, they're really vulnerable, and we can do stuff against them. They're not 10 feet tall like we thought they were. So there's a lot going on.
And that can help describe the proper role for the United States in all of this, right? The Israelis are going to have to deal with Gaza and Hamas, but there's a broader regional component to this that eventually leads back to regional superpowers, to Iran and Saudi Arabia. This is an area where the US has tremendous influence, and that's, I'm sure, where we'll be concentrating our diplomacy and military efforts while the Israelis do what they choose to do in Gaza. Thank you to Dr. Vickers.